Okay, so in part two, we're going to look at agriculture, sugar, and then some of the things that are happening in North America as well. So we got through a couple of the first ideas beforehand. So we had ended by talking about silver mining and how this was conscripted or compelled by the Inca in the past through the Mita system, like a tribute system, and how the Spanish kind of continued that with the encomienda system. So let's move on to look at agriculture a little bit. The idea that the Americas had soil that's very rich for farming is something the Europeans noticed very early on. And of course, the civilizations and the empires that had existed there before had figured out really ingenious ways to use the land and even to grow on food on floating fields as the Aztecs had done, or terrace farming as the Incas had done. And so because the land was so fertile and so productive, many of the European conquistadors, when they settled, set up massive plantations or haciendas, which are just estates, right? So they're usually European owned. Now there are kind of ranks of Europeans. If you were born in the old world, so if you were born in Spain or Portugal, you're a peninsularis, so you come from the Iberian Peninsula, and that and Creoles, which are Europeans who are born in America to European parents born in America. These are the people who were considered like the highest levels of the new kind of social structure that was set up, and they were the ones who could access most of the territory and the land. In some cases, just taking it from the locals, or as local populations were thinned out because of disease, these people would move in and take these, massive amounts of land. Cattle raising and pigs were very important. Pizarro himself had come from or was it Cortez? One of the two had come from a, pig farming family. So those were important. Also, the cultivation of grapes and wheat were other important things. So a lot of different foodstuffs, and then of course meat and leather that you get from those animals. So these were some of the, of course, all the farming was done by indigenous peoples who were, brought onto those or compelled or forced to farm on those lands for the whites, right? We have to talk about sugar because sugar is one of the most important crops, maybe the most important crop that comes out of the Americas. Sugar is an interesting thing to make and manufacture because it's partly factory and it's partly farm. So it's what we call, when we get to the Industrial Revolution, we'll call it proto-industrialization or early industrialization. Now, because the native populations had been thinned out by diseases like smallpox, which I have in this image. This is when smallpox ravaged the Aztec Empire, and just kind of destroyed the ability of that civilization to resist the Europeans. So because of this, they had to find other ways to feed the labor on those farms or the sugar plantations, and it is very, very labor intense. So I thought I had an image here, so let me show you the image first. You can see that it's partly industry. So you've got over here, and so this is more like a factory if you work in here. And there's, flames so the sugarcane has to be cut up, chopped up, mashed, and then it has to be boiled for a long period of time once the husks are removed. And so it's a really interesting production, but very, very labor intense, and it's all very dangerous labor. You can see the fields in the background where the cane would have been made and then or grown. And then you can see on this table here the sugar as it's in its finished product. So this would have probably been a dark brown colored sugar, and it would have been formed into cones that would then harden, and then they could be transported that way. So if those cones would sit on people's tables and when you wanted some sugar, you could scrape off a little bit on the side. They didn't eat nearly as much as we do today, of course, in that, of sugar. But here you can see how sugar consumption has shifted. Sugar consumption in Europe in the 1700s was about 4 pounds annually per person. Europeans hadn't had much access to sugar or sweeteners in general, and so they weren't really sure how to use it, and it took time to kind of develop a taste for it. I think if you would take somebody back then and give them like a sugary soda today, they would just spit it out. It wouldn't be drinkable, to them. But over time, you become acclimated to that. And by 1800, people are eating about 25 pounds annually. Today, it's about 130 pounds, I believe, that we eat of sugar per year on average. And so it's something that became more and more desirable over time. Now, this image shows a sugar plantation in Brazil, right? So in that proto-industrialized system, these plantations were so industrialized, they were referred to as engenhos, or engines, right? Because it's kind of very heavy industrialized labor, right? Now, without the local populations to work on these plantations, these factories, they were forced to sort of bring in labor from other places. So this number from 25 to 2 million, I was looking for where I found it in the book. And I know in another book that I used for a Western Civ, they mentioned just Central America goes from 12 million to 2 million. So I'm not sure. I'll try to figure out where I found this number and back it up. But I know that the 2 million number appears quite a few places. So that seems to be agreed upon. But how many people are here to start is the question, I think. But Europeans who now own the plantations, the haciendas, the engenhos, they had to figure out how to find labor for those massive labor-intensive systems. And of course, that leads to the slave trade. And that's the part of the class that I assign most of the homework parts for, or the online part for. So hopefully, that'll fit in here, and we can link the two together when we get to class on Monday. So my last point here is North America. We have to consider what's happening there, and the issue of race, and why race shows up in different aspects in both places, right? So North America, of course, we're talking about parts of Quebec, which are much larger than it is today. That's the French-speaking part of Canada. Canada has two national languages, right? English and French. And of some of the colonies held by the British. Now, the certain parts of the colonies were Dutch initially. So, like New York used to be New Amsterdam, right? And then was purchased by the English, so they call it New York, right? So keep in mind that North America is kind of poor in natural resources. Animal hides, especially beaver hides, are really important and for trade and highly sought after. Tobacco grows really well in the Americas. And then, of course, lots and lots of timber. Not the really kind of beautiful wood like the mahogany wood that you find in South America, but still timber, which is useful in Europe because Europe by this point has become predominantly deforested. And so they need the timber for framing. Not all the people that come here to the Americas come willingly. So you have to keep in mind some are fleeing debt. They're trying to get away from money they owe. Some are imprisoned. And of course, we know certain colonies like Georgia become a prison colony, or where prisoners are sent. Or in Europe, they call it transported. You get transported to a colony. So that would be the Americas, or eventually places like Australia. And some come as indentured servants. So indentured servitude is something that anyone can, buy into. A young Irish girl, I know in one of my relatives' family lines, they have an Irish girl who came over when she was 7 with a family that she wasn't related to. And she came as a servant to them. They paid for her journey over, and then she was guaranteed to work for them for 7 years after that. And then when she was, 15 or 16, they freed her, and she could go on her way or continue to work for them for pay. So that's kind of like indentured servitude, is like free servants in exchange for usually being transported across the ocean to the New World. So settlement happened for very different reasons. Sometimes people came in order to get rich, and they were hoping to take part of the tobacco trade or fur trade, whatever it might be. Sometimes people fled for religious control. And so the first arrangement is kind of what you have at like Jamestown Colony. And the second, religious control, is what you have in Massachusetts Bay Colony, for example. These very early, in the 1500s, settlements, because people were trying to get away from persecution, mostly against Puritans or serious Protestants at that time. So they generally left home countries. Huguenots, as they're called, or Calvinists, would come to the Americas for various religious freedoms that could be set up. Now, if you consider race and society in the Americas, in North America, the racial stratifications are much more strict than you find in South America, and partly because of the people who came initially, right? But in North America, you have these kind of interesting social hierarchies that develop. So in the North, right, you have kind of native populations, which are the various Indian nations that live here. You have the whites who come across from Europe to the New World, and then you have Africans who are brought as servants or slaves, sometimes indentured servants or slaves. A few come as free people, but most come as servants, or enslaved outright. These communities generally don't intermarry or interact in large amounts. Some cases, Indian communities or Indian nations would trade with the whites for gunpowder weapons and then use them to fuel wars. That happened occasionally, but predominantly these groups remained largely separate. So you have a kind of very strict stratification in North America. Now in South America, it's very different. And if you watch the video that I assigned by Henry Louis Gates, you can see that there are different castas or castes or social systems, right? So at the top you have the whites, whether they're born in the Iberian Peninsula or born in the Americas, either one. Then you have the mestizos, the mixed. If you have a European and a native parent. Mulatto is European and African parent. Zombo is if you have an African parent and a native parent. So all these different versions of that. In the South, in South America, by 1750, half the population is mestizo, they're mixed race. And that's because the original settlers that come from the Iberian Peninsula are almost always male. And so they're quite happy to enter into relationships with the native population or the African slave population. How the native or African slave population felt about this, right, is not quite always well recorded. But in our book, you can see in this image, right, that you have this a European male and his native wife, the female here, and she's dressed very nicely in European fashion. Obviously, he's pretty wealthy. And their child here, who is a mestizo, she's then mixed, right? So, the fact that they had portraits done and that kind of thing, that shows that sometimes they gain status, perhaps, for that. So that's why we've looked at in the Americas. We've looked at some of the major crops. We've looked at what happens in North America and how it's different, lack of those big resources, but development of some others. And then the differences in race, which again is part of our online assignments too.